If you feel this video appeared at an awkward moment in your life, I need to start by saying something uncomfortable. The universe didn't send this to you. It was your own weariness, a weariness that isn't physical, but existential. A weariness of promising change and remaining the same. A weariness of silently repeating, "I'll start tomorrow." There's a kind of burnout that nobody notices. You wake up, function, answer messages, complete tasks. On the outside, nothing seems wrong. But inside, there's a small crack. It appears whenever you say you're going to change, whenever you make an intense, detailed, almost heroic plan, and then you fail. Not because you're incapable, but because you tried to start as if you needed to be reborn entirely in a single day. Have you ever noticed that starting over can be a sophisticated form of escape? It's easier to imagine a perfect new version of yourself than to sustain small, imperfect actions today. The fantasy of a major turnaround produces an immediate feeling of hope. The brain responds to anticipation as if the transformation were already happening. But anticipation doesn't build character. It only momentarily relieves the anxiety of remaining stagnant. And then comes the micro-conflict you rarely admit. You're excited about the plan, but secretly intimidated by the consistency. Intensity is exciting. Repetition demands maturity. You want to feel like you're changing, but you avoid the discomfort of actually changing. Perhaps your greatest addiction isn't distraction nor procrastination. Perhaps it's the addiction to new beginnings. Monday, first day of the month, new year. After that conversation, after that breakup, there's always a symbolic milestone that promises total cleansing. But life doesn't work like a reset button. It works like a flow. The brain doesn't reset when you decide to reset. It continues to be shaped by what you repeat. It's not the intensity of the decision that alters its trajectory, it's the frequency of the action. A slight difference today seems insignificant, but maintained for days, it changes the entire direction. There's something profoundly human about this. You want to change without going through the process of confronting yourself. You want results without facing the initial frustration of not being as good as you'd like. And every time you fail, a subtle voice emerges saying, maybe I'm not disciplined enough. Maybe I don't have the strength. Maybe I'm doomed to start and stop. But observe honestly. Are you truly failing, or are you merely demanding an impossible leap from yourself? There's a difference between growing and harming yourself with unrealistic expectations. When you try to become someone else in a single decision, you are, in fact, rejecting who you are now. And nothing grows from constant rejection. There's a paradox here. The more dramatic your fresh start, the more fragile it becomes. Explosive changes activate internal resistance. Subtle changes build identity. 51% is already progress. Slightly better choice is already reconfiguration. A small compromise fulfilled is already a rebuilding of internal confidence. You are not a failed project. You are a river. And rivers are not ashamed of their curves. They don't stop because they've encountered a rock. They go around it, they persevere, they keep going, even when they seem slow. Perhaps what's lacking isn't strength, but continuity. Perhaps what's lacking isn't motivation, but the humility to start smaller than your pride would like. And perhaps the most honest question isn't, how do I change everything, but what's the next possible step? Because there is something more dangerous than not changing. It's turning every small setback into proof of inadequacy. It's allowing one mistake to erase all the invisible progress you've already built. This is where self-sabotage begins to creep in without you even realizing it. What if the real problem isn't starting? But what do you do after you stumble? The mistake happens silently. You promise yourself you'll eat better, and in the middle of the afternoon, you give in to the impulse. You decide you won't respond to that person anymore, and then, at night, you send the message. You plan to study for an hour, and before you know it, you've spent 40 minutes scrolling through your phone. The slip-up itself is small. What comes after is what changes everything. A quick, almost automatic thought arises, I've already messed up. It seems harmless, but it's the exact point where a behavior becomes an identity. You don't just say, "I made a mistake." You say internally, "This is who I am." And that phrase weighs more than the initial mistake. Imagine someone who spends the entire week trying to organize their routine. You might wake up earlier for 3 days. On the 4th day, you miss your alarm. Instead of adjusting and continuing, you feel intense frustration and abandon everything. Not because the plan was impossible, but because the stumble was interpreted as proof of incompetence. A single deviation tainted the entire narrative. This happens because the mind seeks consistency. When you break a promise, internal discomfort arises. To alleviate this tension, it's easier to continue making mistakes than to correct course. Thus, you transform an isolated slip-up into a series of errors. Not out of malice towards yourself, but to avoid feeling the pain of inconsistency. The problem was never the chocolate, the message, or the delay. It was the meaning you gave to the event. A mistake at 10 in the morning doesn't have to define who you'll be at 5 in the afternoon. But when you conflate behavior with personal values, any failure becomes a sentence. And here's the unsettling surprise. Often you're not trying to ruin the day. You're trying to escape guilt. But in doing so, you reinforce the very pattern you say you want to break. If a single mistake can undermine your discipline, perhaps what's weak isn't your willpower, but how you see yourself. And that leads us to an even more uncomfortable question. If the problem isn't the mistake, what are you really avoiding facing? You say you're putting off tasks, but perhaps you're putting off feelings. The task is concrete. Writing, studying, training, talking. What really weighs on you is the anticipated emotion. Even before you begin, your mind has already simulated failure, fatigue, criticism, comparison. Your body reacts as if the discomfort is already happening. Your heart races slightly, your breathing becomes short, and you call this lack of motivation. But stop for a moment. If the task hasn't even begun, where does this exhaustion come from? It stems from the imagination projecting itself forward. The brain tries to protect you from what might hurt. It prefers avoidance to risk. Avoidance seems prudent, but this prudence, repeated for months, builds an increasingly shorter life. What if what you call procrastination is actually poorly calibrated self-protection? Consider a simple situation. You need to send an important email. Nothing dramatic. Yet you mentally review possible negative responses, imagine judgments, create scenarios of rejection. Your body senses the threat. To alleviate this tension, you open another tab, reply to another message, do anything that restores the feeling of immediate control. The problem wasn't the email. It was the story you built around it. There's an almost invisible detail here. The brain treats vivid simulations as real experiences. Anticipation activates the same alert circuits that would be activated in the face of concrete danger. You suffer before the event, and then you conclude that the task is too arduous. But answer honestly, at this very moment, what is unbearable? The chair, the screen, the silence of the room, or the narrative you projected 5 steps ahead? When you narrow your focus to the pure present, something changes. The task ceases to be an abstract monster and becomes a simple gesture. Writing a sentence, reading a paragraph, taking a deep breath and pressing send. The suffering was scattered in the future. In the now, there is almost always enough space to act. But this reveals an even deeper point. If you're not running away from the task, but from the emotion, then the issue isn't productivity. It's tolerance for discomfort. And the inevitable question arises, what would happen if you remained in that feeling for a few minutes without escaping it? There are people who spend years climbing a mountain they never chose. They study, work, accumulate goals, achieve recognition. On the outside, everything seems coherent. Inside, there's a strange silence after each victory. It's not obvious sadness, it's a lack of meaning, as if something essential is missing from the achievement. Research on satisfaction reveals a curious fact. After basic needs are met, constant increases in status and income produce only short peaks of pleasure. The brain adapts quickly. What seemed extraordinary yesterday becomes the norm today. This explains why so many people achieve what they swore was their ultimate goal, and yet still feel a kind of subtle emptiness. Imagine someone who worked for 10 years to buy a specific car. For months, they imagined the scene, the steering wheel in their hands, the feeling of victory. When they finally buy it, they experience a few days of euphoria. Then, life returns to normal. The car remains. The euphoria does not. What was being sought perhaps was not the object itself, but the validation it promised. Many goals are born less from an inner calling and more from comparison. We observe what others celebrate and learn to desire the same. We call this personal ambition, but it is often reflected desire. It's like looking in the mirror and not realizing that what you see is accumulated influence. Studies in psychology show that goals linked to internal values, such as growth, contribution, and autonomy, produce greater emotional stability than goals focused solely on image and approval. The difference lies not in the effort, but in the origin of the desire. When motivation is external, the reward depends on the gaze of others. When it is internal, it depends on the coherence between action and identity. Perhaps that's why some achievements bring unease. You reach the top and realize that's not where you wanted to be. The question we rarely ask is simple and unsettling. If no one were watching, would I still want this? What if part of your anxiety doesn't stem from a lack of results, but from chasing the wrong mountain? There's a kind of pain that doesn't make a sound. It doesn't scream. It doesn't explode. It doesn't call attention to itself. It settles in. It's the distance between what happened and what you believe should have happened. Someone didn't apologize. An opportunity was denied. A relationship ended unfairly. Life went on, but something inside you remained stuck in that scene. At first, resentment seems legitimate. It gives a sense of moral strength. You relive the episode and reaffirm, I was right. This narrative creates a stable identity. You weren't just hurt, you were wronged. And this difference sustains pride. The problem is that the body doesn't distinguish between intense memory and present experience. Every time you mentally replay the story, you activate the same physiological threat responses. The tension returns, your breathing changes, your stomach contracts. You believe you're just remembering. In practice, you're reopening it. Over time, indignation ceases to be a reaction and becomes a structure. It begins to organize your perception of the world. You start to expect new injustices. You interpret ambiguities as attacks. You reinforce your own narrative. It's a silent cycle. Imagine someone who was betrayed years ago. The relationship ended, routines changed, new people came into their lives. Yet, every time they feel the slightest suspicion, they react with disproportionate intensity. It's not about the present. It's about the wound that has never healed internally. The past is no longer happening, but it continues to be relived. There's a paradox that's hard to accept. Holding on to resentment gives a sense of control, but in reality, it prolongs emotional dependence on the past. You believe you're preserving your dignity, but perhaps you're preserving the pain. Letting go doesn't mean saying it was fair. It doesn't mean forgetting. It means interrupting the automatic repetition. It means recognizing that continuing to feed the story doesn't change the original fact. It only deepens the mark it left. Many people confuse forgiveness with moral absolution. That's not it. It's an internal act of self-preservation. It's deciding that your psychic energy will not be eternally dedicated to an episode that can no longer be changed. It's removing the past from the center of your identity. And here arises a question that few dare to face. Who would you be if you could no longer use this pain as an explanation? Without the story of injustice, what part of you would need to mature? Resentment can become comfortable because it offers justification. It explains rigidity, distrust, coldness. It protects, but it also limits. By clinging to the wound, you prevent new interpretations from emerging. There is a silent form of freedom that doesn't depend on anyone apologizing. It begins when you decide not to turn what happened into a permanent destiny. When you understand that honoring your own pain doesn't require cultivating it indefinitely. Perhaps the issue isn't what they did to you. Perhaps it's what you keep doing to yourself by reliving it every day. Perhaps after all that has been said, you are expecting an extraordinary technique, a formula that will solve years of repetition in just a few days. But the truth is simpler and more demanding. The change that lasts doesn't come from emotional intensity. It comes from consistently applied awareness. You don't need to become a different person. You need to become slightly more lucid in your future decisions. There's a silent point before every habit, before picking up your phone, before responding with irritation, before giving up because it's already ruined. This point lasts seconds. It's almost invisible. But that's where your freedom begins. When you notice the impulse without immediately obeying it, you create space. And in that space, there is choice. So here is a clear, straightforward, and feasible plan. First, reduce the size of the change. Don't try to reorganize your entire life. Choose a single behavior that, if improved by 1%, would already alter your direction. It could be going to bed 20 minutes earlier. It could be writing a page. It could be walking for 10 minutes. Small enough not to scare you, consistent enough to build confidence. Second, divide the day. A mistake at 9 a.m. doesn't define who you'll be at 3 p.m. If you fail, don't let it define your identity. Adjust in the next hour. Train this skill like you train a muscle. The goal isn't perfection, it's a quick return to balance. Third, practice mindful observation for 5 minutes a day. Sit in silence and simply notice your thoughts and impulses. Don't fight them, just observe. This simple exercise strengthens the part of you that chooses, rather than the part that reacts. Over time, you will begin to notice the impulse before it turns into action. Fourth, question your goals. Ask yourself honestly, if no one were watching, would I still want this? If the answer is no, perhaps it's time to adjust course. Goals aligned with your values produce stable energy. Goals based on comparison produce anxiety. Fifth, close internal cycles. Choose a story of resentment that you frequently repeat. Write about it one last time, not to reinforce the pain, but to consciously declare that it will not define your future. You don't control what happened, but you do control how much it will continue to shape your decisions. None of this is dramatic. None of this seems grand. And that's precisely why it works. True transformations are subtle. They happen in everyday life, in silence, in almost invisible repetition. The right moment isn't an external sign. It's the instant you decide to stop running away from your own emotional responsibility. Not the responsibility of being perfect, but the responsibility of continuing. If something in this video accurately described you, don't ignore that identification. Use it as a starting point. Subscribe to the channel to continue deepening this journey of awareness. Like the video, so that more people who are struggling in silence can find it. And if you wish, share your experience or your question in the comments. You can write anonymously. The important thing is to transform reflection into action. Change doesn't begin when you feel ready. It begins when you decide to stay, even imperfect.